Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Renee Bender. I am the director of the Forensic Psychiatry program in our department, and we're in for a real treat this morning. I've known Dr. Alan Newman for 25 years, and I first met him at the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, where Dr. Newman was known as the technology person. He knew more about technology than anyone. And especially in those days, most of us didn't know very much. And Alan would give presentations about how to use it and how to be more concise, and wonderful websites that people could go to. He moved to San Francisco in 2014 and is currently a faculty member in our program, where he teaches the landmark case seminar together with the chancellor of Hastings Law School. Dr. Newman has a long history as an educator. He's directed 2 residency training programs, 2 forensic fellowship programs, and a medical student education program. He was previously on the faculty of the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, Georgetown University, Tulane University, and University of Arkansas. And his medical training was at the University of Arkansas and Tulane University School of Medicine. Dr. Newman is an outstanding forensic psychiatrist. He provides consultations in medical malpractice, hospital safety issues, anti-government extremism, which we're going to hear about this morning, technology issues, and criminal responsibility. He also served as captain in the Army Medical Corps, and he received the Best Teacher Award in a Forensic Fellowship Program by the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. So, Dr. Newman.
Thank you, Dr. Bender, and thank you, Dr. Rose, and thank you all for inviting me to be in your wonderful, beautiful new building. I'm so jealous of getting to work in this building. I want to get an office as soon as we're finished here. But really a lovely, lovely space. And thank you for letting me talk about a topic that I've had an interest in a very long time, which is the sovereign citizen movement, and got to evaluate my first person with this kind of ideology way back in the late 90s, before most people had heard of it, before I'd ever heard of it. But it's something that is surprisingly often in the news, but at the same time, lots of people haven't heard of it. So hopefully this will introduce you to what potentially can be a very interesting dilemma that you might encounter, particularly if you do courtroom work, as I do. I can advance my slide. The usual disclosures for a forensic talk. The first disclosure is we talk about criminals, murder, horrible people, bad stuff. Hopefully I will keep it reasonable, but that's often the nature. But as far as the typical disclosures, I'm not going to be talking about medications or off-label treatments. It's primarily about diagnostics and evaluations. And this is mostly just a topic that I find interesting and have evaluated people doing it. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, there's several topics I'm hoping to get through. I'm going to talk about the basics of competency to stand trial, the beliefs of the sovereign citizen movement, the origins and evolution of this movement, what evaluating a sovereign is actually like, and people that seem like sovereigns but may not be. And then hopefully at the end, I'll have enough time to get into theories about conspiracy theories, because this topic is really much broader. And I think if you've been keeping up with things like QAnon in the news, a lot of the principles that apply to this group actually apply to thinking about any group that adheres to conspiracy beliefs. And that, I hope, will let me introduce to you some ideas on cognitive biases and heuristics, mental models that are used by people that fall into conspiracy-like traps. So here we are in beautiful San Francisco, or actually, here we are. But I want to take you out of San Francisco to a place that maybe some of you have visited, which is Kansas City. Any of you been to Kansas City? Excellent. All right, Dr. Becker. So I've been to Kansas City. One of the first things you learn about Kansas City is it's actually in two states because there's two Kansas cities, Kansas City, Missouri, which is the historic city, and then Kansas City, Kansas sort of started as a streetcar suburb. And unlike a lot of cities that have this kind of division, even though it's on a big river, the river is not the natural dividing line. It's part of the dividing line, but as the city sprawled, you just have a state border that just goes right through this metropolitan area, which means that you can be driving down the street in Missouri in a neighborhood, and next thing you know, you're in Kansas and everything looks the same. Why is this significant? Because when you commit a crime that involves transporting a person across a state border, you may wind up in federal court rather than state court, which is exactly what happened in the case that I'm going to use to introduce the concepts of the day. It's a case from the late 50s, two teenage boys and a man way too old to be hanging out with them, a 33-year-old World War II vet, kidnapped a teenage girl, drove her across the state line from Missouri to Kansas, and assaulted her. This didn't get a lot of news attention at the time. The boys went through the typical sort of juvenile pleadings, but there was something wrong with the man, whose name was Milton Richard Dusky. He was clearly psychologically disturbed in some way, had recently gone through, split up with his wife, was separated from his family, he's hanging out with kids, committing offenses. And so they sent him to the United States Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, which is one of the largest federal forensic hospitals. It's also used as a prison, to evaluate him. He was evaluated by a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, sure, he's competent to be stand trial. He's oriented to time and place, and he has some recollection of the events. And that was a problem. And this went up to the United States Supreme Court, and it became what is arguably, and this is a class that I teach to UCSF fellows, landmark cases in forensic psychiatry. It's probably one of our top 5 biggest cases, which is called the Dusky case, where the Supreme Court said that the test for competency to stand trial must be whether the person had sufficient presentability to consult with his attorney with a reasonable degree of rational understanding, and whether he had a rational as well as factual understanding of the proceedings against him. So first of all, it had to be about presentability, not what was he like 6 years ago or even at the time of the crime, but what's he like when he's on trial. Does he have the ability to work with his attorney, not just in a communication way, but in a rational way? And does he understand the process, understand the proceedings? And I've done more than 1,000 forensic evals of this type, and the factual understanding is the easiest part. The hardest part is the rational part, and there's a lot of debates. I've had cases where I sat on the court, I sat in the chair for 3 hours, 5 hours, just arguing about what does rational understanding mean. This really trips people up, and it still trips me up and everybody who does this. But with all of that in mind, I want you to imagine that you have been asked by a judge or an attorney to evaluate some defendants. So I've got some defendants. These are not people I evaluated, but people that are on the public internet. And we're going to start. Oh my goodness, I got a strange cutoff here.
Sir, today I'm appearing as the agent and settler for David Hall.
Okay.
David Hall has been charged with a traffic stop in Florida, pretty minor charge. But as polite as he seems, after he was charged, he filed a $500,000 lien against the judge and a $20 million lien against the highway patrol. So less nice than he seems here.
Could you get Mr. Hall for me then, sir? Where is he?
I go by that name, sir. My name sounds exactly like the defendant's, and I'm here to settle that matter today.
So are you and David Hall one and the same person?
I'm not a person, I'm an individual. David Hall is a person. Okay. I am the agent to that name. Are you and David
Hall one and the same individual? The person who goes by the name of David Hall who's standing in front of you.
I'm the individual. I am an individual, not a person.
You're not a person.
Yes, sir. David Hall is a person. I am a private individual. David Hall is a person under color of law, sir.
Okay. Where's David Hall then? The person David Hall.
He exists on paper, sir. David Hall is a corporation.
David Hall is a corporation. who exists on paper. You can see why a judge might be wondering what's going on here. What is going on here? Here's another person. This was a guy, Robert Peterson from Idaho, who was riding his bike without a light at nighttime. And he decides to show up to court filming every single thing. So he has a very minor charge, but he won't turn his camera off, which violates the rules.
Robert Peterson has been out on bail for a few weeks now and is confident that things will go his way.
Narrator, it didn't. So.
What's your first and last name?
I don't have a last name.
You don't have a last name?
No.
And what's your first name?
I don't have a first name either. I've got a name. My name is Robert. You can call me Robert. I'm not a person. See, you deal here with Admiralty Maritime Jurisdiction, which deals with persons, which I am not.
Are you a U.S. citizen?
No.
You're not a U.S. citizen?
I was not born in Washington, D.C. or any territory of the under federal jurisdiction, so no, I'm not a U.S.
Were
citizen.
you born in the United States of America and any of the states?
I was born in America. Yes, I'm a state citizen of one of the several states.
Which state?
Idaho?
Idaho. Can I see your Idaho state license?
No, I don't have one.
You don't have one?
My person does, but I don't. And I don't wish to create joinder with you. Excuse me.
Camera.
Excuse me. You're blocking my freedom of movement.
I am.
All right. Well, P. Barnes, you just admitted to me that you're violating my rights. Please step aside. I'm going in.
No, you're not going in.
Don't touch me.
You're not going in, sir.
Let the record show that you just battered me.
That's a taser. If I kept playing this, you get him being tasered, but I decided to not show that. There's 100 of these on the internet. People who go to court and they start saying these very odd things like, I'm not a person, I'm a corporation. This is Admiralty law. This is a case, I don't have video of the hearing, but Robert Sperlazzo was a Chicago community activist who was making fraudulent documents. And when he went to court, he said he considered himself sovereign, an American national, not a citizen. He said he was of the people, but not a person, and that a person is a legal fiction. And he identified himself as Robert Dale of the House Sperlazzo and accused the judge of operating a kangaroo court. Now, this judge, Val Gunnarsson, was aware of the sovereign citizen movement, and he had the great line that I used as the title of this talk: the court system's rules are different than the courtroom in your head. And that's really what's going on, that these individuals have a courtroom in their head, a series of laws and a framework of our country that is very different and rarely works out for them. He got 180 days in court, 180 days in jail just for contempt of court. Now, what's going on with these people? And there's so many more. I could have filled the whole hour with them. It was so hard to pick which ones to show you. But all these beliefs come down to a canon of beliefs that are shared by people that subscribe to this ideology. And it starts with this revisionist view of our country. The view was that when the country was founded, the United States, that it was founded on common law, God's law, the Magna Carta, all of these things, somewhat partially true. But according to them, at some point in our history, that all changed. And we secretly switched to maritime law. Maritime law, with probably secret control of the British government or some other entity. And there's a debate about when did this switch happen? Was it when the 14th Amendment was passed? Did it happen in 1933 when we abandoned the gold standard? Did it happen in 1871? There's different theories within the sovereign movement. But nonetheless, we're under this admiralty jurisdiction. And when you see this flag in court with the fringe, they'll say, well, that's because that's a naval flag. And that means that this courtroom is operating under this secret condition. Sovereigns are very interested in the issue of the gold standard. Now, the gold standard, it used to be that you could literally trade your money for gold. That was like a requirement under the law, which was very problematic, especially because the government couldn't control inflation. And if there were a run on a bank and everyone shows up at once and wants gold, it's not going to work. So in 1933, along with a number of other countries, we abandoned the gold standard. And the government said, look, you got to turn in your gold. It actually was illegal to own your own personal stash of gold for several decades. And it became legal again, I think, in the 70s. But sovereigns have ruminated on this idea of the gold standard. What happened to America? Because gold backs up our currency. So if gold was the collateral for our money and you get rid of gold, what is the new collateral? Well, the new collateral is you. That's right. So the sovereign belief is that we essentially, as a country, foreclosed our entire financial system and traded off our gold standard to people being essentially mortgaged off to the secret cabal that rules the world. Now, when you buy something, you get a receipt. This is the golden gift. This was not my receipt. My receipt this morning was $8.50. 1965, it was 25 cents. But you buy something, you get a receipt. Well, what's your receipt if you're sold to these international corporations? Your receipt is your birth certificate. So sovereigns believe that your birth certificate is actually your receipt that pledges a certain amount of money. And notice, this is President Obama's birth certificate. Notice how it's in all caps. Nothing else is in caps. That means something to sovereigns. What it means to them is that this is a clue. This isn't your real person. Remember the people saying, I'm not a person, I am a corporation, I'm a fictitious person. So sovereigns believe that there's something called the straw man. It's different than your flesh and blood person. You are you, and then the straw man is your digital you. And that digital you is worth money. And some will claim that it's worth hundreds of thousands, maybe even $1 billion. And you can get this money. You just got to hire the right consultant, which are called redemption consultants. And these used to be all over the internet, and they still are, but they've gotten rid of a lot of them because it's a fraud. But you could go to these websites, and these consultants will be happy to take your money to help you get the $1 billion that your birth certificate is worth for a nominal fee of $1,000. And you used to be able to go to YouTube and you would find these things. Your birth certificate erases your debt. Your birth certificate is worth billions. There's so many of these. And people would fall for the fraud. But I think the people selling the fraud also bought it. They believed it, even though I don't think they had their own $1 billion. Probably the most famous was this man, David Wynn Miller. I should say this was David Wynn Miller. He died a few years ago. He was one of the more infamous redemption consultants because he had invented his own grammar. He would say, I am federal postal judge, David Wynn, Miller. Now, first time I told somebody that, they said, come on. So I can prove it.
My name is Federal Postal Judge, David Wynn, Miller.
Okay, we'll see more of him in a minute. That was a meeting he had in Maui, Hawaii, where people would learn how to use his secret language, which you could go to his website, and it really looks like this insane stream of consciousness, which he called quantum language parse syntax grammar. But if you can file your pleadings using this language, then it will help you win your cases. And really what's going on is that the people are adhering to this idea that judges are actually wizards. You all recognize this? Harry Potter? Right, this Cornelius Fudge. So judges are really wizards. And if you can just say the right spell, then extemporamus or whatever, then you get your money. It rarely works out that way. And by rarely, I mean never. But yet this caught on. But sovereigns have some other interesting beliefs. If you remember A Tale of Two Cities, the vigilante courts, fascinating story. There was like Madame Defarge who would sew the names of people that were doomed to be executed. The sovereign citizens fantasize about one day controlling the court systems and forming their own grand juries where they're going to execute or try people. And why wait? They're already doing it. And so people have received these phony writs, court order. Imagine you get a court order that says you need to show up at this court and you are responsible for this money. This is happening and people are terrified because they get these things in the mail, these phony writs. And obviously this is not legal. But what they're doing is they're filing tons of liens, filling up the court system using paper warfare. And in some ways, it just ties up the system. Other ways, it swindles people. Sometimes they'll claim somebody's house, move into it, file a lien against the owners. It's very disorienting to people who don't realize what's going on. Now, is this just a legal game that people are playing? And some people have referred to this as paper terrorism. Well, it's paper terrorism, but sometimes it's terrorism. So in my home state of Arkansas a few years ago, there was this man, Jerry Kane, not from Arkansas, driving through the state. He and his son, Joe Kane, 16-year-old homeschooled teenager, were redemption consultants. They were going around giving seminars, teaching people how to get this money, which they'd never figured out how to do, and they weren't very good at it or successful. But one day they're driving through Arkansas, and a drug task force sees this car with a homemade cardboard license plate and pulls them over. Mr. Kane started arguing with the police officer, confronting him, and then next thing you know, it got very bad. Joe Kane, the teenager, jumps out of the car with an AK-47 or an AR-15, I don't remember the gun, and shot both police officers dead. Within an hour, the father and son who had been trying to escape got cornered in a Walmart parking lot where they faced off with almost the entire police force of the town. And as a result of this, the two of them were shot dead. Now, when the police investigated this crime, they noticed that the car had a fake registration that took them to a town in New Vienna, Ohio, which neither of them were actually from. Turned out that lots of sovereign citizens claimed that their car was registered to this address in New Vienna, Ohio, which turned out to be the former headquarters of the Aryan Nations Church. What's going on here? Is that just a coincidence? Of course not. And that will transition us into this idea of what is the origin of this movement? Where did it come from? And where it came from was from a very unusual interpretation of religious scripture that goes back to the 1700s in Britain. But let me step back a little further. For those of you who are less familiar with the Bible, this is Joseph from the famous Coat with Many Colors and his brothers. And these brothers were what became the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, in the biblical tradition, Joseph was tricked by his brothers, sold off as a slave in Egypt, but then later the brothers came to Egypt during a famine, and by this point, Joseph had actually become an advisor to the Pharaoh, and they lived prosperously in Egypt for a while before they eventually wound up enslaved again. And if you've seen the movie or you know the story, the Ten Commandments, it's all about Moses leading these tribes out of Egypt and back into Palestine, into Canaan, into the ancestral land. And so there were these tribes in the Bible, and they crossed the Red Sea, went through Sinai, and then for a period of time, there was an early ancient kingdom of Israel, and each tribe had its own region. Eventually, this early kingdom of Israel split into northern and southern kingdoms, but the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, the Babylonians. And at that point, the tribes from that region are lost to history to a great extent. The southern tribes, even though they were eventually conquered by the Babylonians, maintained the culture and heritage. But the mystery of what happened to the lost tribes of Israel has gotten a lot of attention over the centuries. A lot of biblical scholars believe that it was just ethnic cleansing, assimilation. Maybe they didn't disappear at all. They just became practicing other religions. But this debate about the mysterious lost tribes of Israel has preoccupied certain people over the years. And one of the most fascinating, I'm not going to call it theory because it's too unbelievable to be a theory, is that the lost tribes of Israel wound up in England. That's right. And believe it or not, this was a mainstream belief among certain religious scholars in the 1700s. And Richard Brothers was one of the founders of what was called British Israelism. And it was this claim that he was a British man, that we are the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Now, this was not an anti-Semitic movement at that time, and nor was it considered extremely fringe. In fact, you recognize this guy, Benjamin Rush? You'll recognize this. He's the dude on our logo for the APA. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, actually was fascinated by this idea of the lost tribes of Israel. He thought that maybe the Native Americans were the lost tribe, and he wanted Lewis and Clark to try to figure out if they were the lost tribes of Israel. So this was a semi-mainstream belief in the 1800s in Britain, but in the 1900s, this man, Howard Rand, who was a racist anti-Semite, put a twist on it. And his argument was that not only were British, and by extension Americans of British descent, the true lost tribes of Israel, but he would claim that people today who claim that they're Jewish, who were the descendants of the surviving tribes, are somebody else and not the chosen people. And he, along with this man, William Cameron, founded what was called the Anglo-Saxon Federation of America. Now, William Cameron was extremely important and influential because he was the ghostwriter and editor for this man, Henry Ford. William Cameron wrote the newspaper that Henry Ford published, which was called the Dearborn Independent. And they published a series called The International Jew, The World's Problems. And it was based on the famous forgery called the Protocols of Zion, which is the most anti-Semitic document created in probably history. But Ford's Americanized version of this got very wide press, was translated into numerous languages, including German, and Hitler actually read and liked it, and it had some influence on his own thinking when he wrote Mein Kampf. It's amazing that Ford, he eventually pseudo-apologized, but I think a lot of people believed that he didn't really mean it, and he shared these beliefs for the rest of his life. Now, when Ford published these books, he didn't copyright any of this. And so lots of other people took over and published it for him. And one of them was this man, Gerald L.K. Smith, who at the time was an extremely famous politician in America. He's now most famous for this huge statue of Jesus that's in northern Arkansas, called the Christ of the Ozarks. But at the time, he ran for president and he was very influential, gave lots of speeches.
Same conspirators who would destroy our nation and its independence, these same forces are ready to commit the Asiatics, the Africans, and the European multitude. This campaign to destroy our immigration tradition is supported by every Jewish and communist organization in the world.
Gerald Smith, openly racist, openly anti-Semitic, invented a term called Christian nationalism. Everything I've seen has shown that he was the first person to regularly use that term, Christian nationalism. He wanted to combine his version of Christianity, which was a very racist, anti-Semitic version. His protege was this man, Dr. Wesley Smith. Dr. Wesley Smith was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And by the way, these guys are based out of places like Los Angeles. It was a much different world in the 50s. Wesley Smith was an even bigger racist than L.K. Smith, and he was very famous for promoting a view of Adam and Eve that argued that there were actually multiple creations. Adam and Eve were not the first creation, and that the earlier creations were flawed creations, and that's where the non-white races of the earth came from. But he took it even further and made it.
In the 45th verse of the 15th chapter is written that the first man, that's the first white man, now Adam violated divine law. The law he violated was relative to racial purity, and God had to cleanse it. And I can show you the records of the violation and exactly what it involved.
So what Swift preached, for lack of a better term, was that Eve was actually impregnated by the serpent, and that these offspring, Cain being the first of the offspring, were the satanic offspring. And his belief was that the people today that claimed to be, so not only was he Christian identity in claiming that the British were the lost tribes of Israel, he claimed that modern Jews were the descendants of this pairing. Swift, unsurprisingly, had followers that were even worse than him. One of them was this man, Richard Butler, who eventually took over Swift's church and renamed it the Aryan Nations. But what's more interesting, but more lost to history to most people, is this man, William Potter Gale. William Potter Gale was, how do you describe him? A very charismatic former Army colonel. And he became very enraged in 1957 during the Little Rock Central desegregation movement. And he claimed that we need to form what's called a posse comitatus to resist the government. He got that term from a law that had been passed in the late 1700s that prohibited the military being used to enforce civil rights. William Potter Gale eventually founded this group, the Sheriff's Posse Comitatus. Now, the interesting wrinkle about William Potter Gale was, even though he was as or more anti-Semitic than his mentor, or his mentor, he was actually half Jewish. His father was Jewish. And William Potter Gale lied and kept that a secret from his own followers, because that would have obviously undermined the message he was sending. So William Potter Gale was virulently racist, but he was also plagiarized by a different man. This man from Portland, whose name was Mike Beach. Mike Beach stole the idea of posse comitatus. Mike Beach himself had been a member of a group called the Silver Shirts with the Nazi sympathizers in the 30s. And what Mike Beach did was he released a document, and he started to engage in the tactics that we now think of with sovereign citizens. They would demand arrests of law enforcement officers. They would file liens against people. They would file lawsuits, and he would threaten violence. And he got a lot of press for this, the posse comitatus. Now, for a while, it was all talk, but then this man came along, Gordon Call, who was a North Dakota farmer who was wanted for, unsurprisingly, not paying his taxes. He wrote a letter in the 60s saying, "I'm no longer going to pay taxes to the synagogue of Satan." He was a huge anti-Semite. He was convicted of tax evasion. When he got out, he continued to not pay his taxes, and he's going to get arrested. But he started organizing farmers in what was called the farm crisis. So in the early 80s, there was this enormous farm crisis where family-owned farms were closing because of business changes and how the loans were made and mechanization. And these farmers were ripe recruits for an organization like Posse Comitatus. So Gordon Call, while he was organizing one of these Posse Comitatus meetings, was confronted by some U.S. Marshals there to take him into custody for tax evasion. But Call was much better armed and wound up killing 2 U.S. Marshals in a shootout, went on the run, and then ultimately wound up in my home state of Arkansas, where he was fatally shot by a sheriff in a blazing fire. Call was buried as a hero. A lot of people lost their taste for this movement, but it continued on in the form of what's called the Militia Movement. Now, the Militia Movement was driven really by 2 big 1990s events that those of us who are a little older remember really vividly. In 1992, there was a siege of a compound in Idaho called the Ruby Ridge Compound. And then in 1993, the more famous of these 2 was the 51-day siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, which ultimately led to this huge fire that killed many of the people there. After these 2 events, there was this militias springing up everywhere in response to what they thought was government overreach. One of the most famous was called the Michigan Militia. One of the early members of this Michigan Militia was this guy, Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols was what I call a proto-sovereign. I don't know that he ever called himself a sovereign citizen, but he declared he was not a citizen of the country. He refused to pay his taxes. He did all the sovereign stuff. And he teamed up with one of his former Army buddies, Timothy McVeigh, and they committed the largest terrorist attack on U.S. soil by American citizens, the Oklahoma City bombing. The Oklahoma City bombing was sort of a turning point, I think, in a lot of people's views about this kind of violence. But there was one group at this time that honed in the militia, sovereign citizen ideology. And these were a group of angry farmers called the Montana Freemen. Leroy Schweitzer was the leader. And he and these farmers had gone to a seminar where they had learned these scams about how to rip people off. And they used this combined approach. And it was the same kind of scam about gold standard and liens and lawsuits. But what they did was they holed up in their ranch and they engaged in all sorts of financial crimes. They would counterfeit checks, and then they would buy things with the checks and then return the items and demand the money back. They would use counterfeit checks to buy guns and ammo. And finally, they were getting foreclosed, and they said, we're not leaving. And the government was, we don't need another Ruby Ridge. We don't need another Waco. So they did a siege, but they did not want to do the big thing. So they have a siege. Eventually, these guys surrendered. They made very big fools of themselves in court. Here's Schweitzer. I'm Supreme Court Justice Leroy Michael. Supreme Court is in session. You're removed from the bench under impeachment. He was like the first sovereign citizen in court. How did this work out for him? Not good. He died in prison. And most of the freemen got very long sentences. Now, what's interesting is that around the time of this, there was a huge decline in the Patriot movement. It just dropped from these high numbers in 95 and 96 to it plummeting. And at this point, the sovereign movement really shifted from a militia movement to the tactics spreading to anti-government tax protesters. It didn't hurt that the internet started really hitting the scene in the late 90s as well. But something interesting happened with the militia movement. Look what happens in 2009. Boom, it's back. And you can probably not be surprised that some of this was in response to right-wing agitation about Obama's election. So people ask me, are sovereign citizens just white supremacists? Well, surprisingly not. The ideas have spread to other groups. So there's a group based on what was originally called the Moorish Science Temple. And this tax scheme started in the late 90s among New York sanitation workers, but they were using all of the sovereign citizen tactics, even though they were African Americans. They have ads on the internet that use the same straw man, you're a corporation language. They use all the same tactics, and sometimes they get violent. So in Baton Rouge, there were 3 police officers killed in 2016 by an African American sovereign citizen. This group is still in the news. In fact, these are headlines all from the last year: a roadside standoff in Massachusetts, someone possessing someone's house. Here was one from last month: Moorish national members arrested after breaking into NASCAR driver's mansion. So this is not ancient history. Sovereign citizen, this is last month. And in the last few years, a lot of the literature has actually been on the African-American sovereign citizens. And I think part of it is driven by the fact that the word has sort of gotten out that they're these white supremacist militia types. But when you're in a competency to stand trial court in New York City, and someone is expressing these beliefs, it might not cross your mind that they're adhering to the same ideology. So a lot of the recent attention has really been around that. Now, the question is this just an American phenomenon? And the answer, of course, is no. It has spread to Canada. It's spread to the United Kingdom. It's spread to Australia. It's like, okay, well, those are Commonwealth countries, Magna Carta. No, it's everywhere. It's starting to go all over the world. So we've seen movements spring up in Germany. In Germany, there's a group, a slow transition, called the Reichsbürger movement. They believe that the Weimar Constitution is still in effect, very anti-Semitic, lots of guns. They issue their own currency. It's sovereign citizens. In Italy, there's a sovereign citizen movement called Del Regno Sovrano di Gaia. In France, there's a sovereign citizen movement called the One Nation movement, or the Etre Souverains. In Russia, this is my favorite sovereign citizen movement, because the Russian sovereign citizen movement believes that the country that secretly controls them is the United States. So all of our concerns about Putin, there's a group in Russia that thinks that we're the ones secretly controlling them. So how do you evaluate these people? Well, the DSM isn't very helpful. How many diagnoses are in the DSM? There's hundreds of them. And there's this tendency to think, well, if it's not in the DSM, does that mean they're normal? And I got curious, how many times the word normal actually appear in the DSM? I counted. It's 202 times, but it's never defined. And that's okay. You know, does the DSM define normal? Should it? Probably not. But are we very good at recognizing when people don't have what we would think of as traditional psychopathology? And part of the problem is that most of us don't even really know what we mean when we say normal, or we do what we know what we mean, but we mean different things. Is it an absence of pathology? Is it just being within a normal distribution? Is it doing the things that are acceptable to the majority? And which majority? Who decides? Is it having no social or occupational dysfunction? Is it just whatever isn't in the DSM? And the reason I say this is that most sovereigns don't meet any DSM criteria, or they might meet something that we don't really think about. But from a forensic psychiatric perspective, maybe it doesn't even matter. Under the law, a psychiatric diagnosis varies. It varies based on the legal issue. There may be a statutory definition, or maybe not. It may be detailed, it may be vague. It may be completely up to the judge or the jury. And if you look at state definitions of things like mental disease or defect, they may be written in a way that allows a diagnosis like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, intellectual disability, and not allow for insanity or competency, things like kleptomania, pedophilia, alcohol intoxication. So one of the first things you learn in your forensic training is the DSM is not the same as mental disease or defect. But is there a mental disease or defect with these people? Someone once said, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If your only tool is the DSM, the nail are the people you're evaluating. And sometimes when you evaluate sovereigns, and I've evaluated a few, it is a nail because you evaluate them and you discover they have delusional disorder, schizophrenia, paranoid personality disorder. And if you can show that they meet one of those classical psychotic diagnoses, then you approach them like you would approach anybody else when you're thinking of competency to stand trial. But the DSM is not so great with delusion-like beliefs, things that seem delusion-y, but maybe they aren't. The definition in the full text is very short. I don't think it's that great. And even though they tell you to take into consideration cultures, if you don't know the culture, how do you take it into consideration? And one example I want to give you is this man, Jared Loughner. Some of you may remember this was the man that shot Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords in Arizona 10 years ago. When Jared Loughner was arrested, some people noticed that his web presence was talking about odd grammar, strange communication, talking about conspiracies, the Illuminati, but he was also almost certainly clearly psychotic. Is he both? And so if you're evaluating somebody that expresses sovereign beliefs, but maybe or maybe they're not psychotic, you approach them like you would approach any other psychiatric patient. Now, it's interesting. David Wynn-Willer actually was confronted because it turned out that Loughner was copying some of his ideas. And Miller said, you know, to go out and kill that many people, that's just crazy. So, you know, he was very quick to distance himself from that. Now, what's interesting about David Wynn-Miller was some of his own ideas were a little strange, like his name. But
You're going to find out that I was taken when I was 8 years old. I went into a UFO for 3.5 hours. They put a machine on top of my head, and whatever they did to me, they put all this information into my head. I sleep 3 hours a day. I didn't sleep for 8 years completely. I was, for those that don't know, I died on December 3rd, 1975. I had my right kidney removed. Both of my adrenal glands were surgically removed. Well, it left me, I went into anesthesia shock and I was flatlined. I died on the operating table. They couldn't jump start me and I wound up in a morgue, cut in half with my heart hanging out of my chest for 35 minutes without a heartbeat. And I was jump started. My heart started beating and they rushed me back upstairs and they put me back together. I woke up 2 hours out of surgery and stayed awake for 8 consecutive years.
Now, I'm not diagnosing David Wynn-Miller. but that's objectively different than just sovereign beliefs. But it also could be just part of the grift. When you get the letter from some of the phishing scams and the words are deliberately misspelled, and you're thinking, who would ever fall for this? There's some evidence that maybe they deliberately are outrageous, because if you're trying to grift a whole bunch of people, you want to catch the most gullible people. So this might just be part of the game. We'll never know. But with Loeffner, how do you figure it out? The same as any psych patient. He was sent to the same place as Dusky, Missouri. He was evaluated by a psychiatrist and a psychologist. They saw that he had hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. The sovereign beliefs were just a coincidence, a thing that he gravitated to. But what if you have a defendant that only has delusion-like beliefs? They're not hearing voices, they're not disorganized. These people are harder. I tell my trainees, compare them to known subcultures. Is this something that other people believe, or is it idiosyncratic? Explore the process of their thinking. How did they conclude their beliefs were true? It's not enough to just say fixed false belief. You want to understand how is it that they believe what they believe. Now, I don't know how many of the trainees are familiar with the Brown Assessment of Belief Scale. There's 4 or 5 of these out there. If you're assessing delusions, especially in someone who's only got delusions, I strongly recommend you learn about these measures, because they will give you a much more sophisticated understanding of a person with possible delusional thinking. It helps you explore, what's their conviction about their belief? What is their perception of how others view their belief? How fixed are the ideas? What happens when you try to convince them the ideas aren't true? If you don't dig in a little deeper, I think it's easier to make mistakes. And fortunately, in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a whole bunch of journal articles that have really looked at the idea of maybe we're thinking about delusions wrong. Maybe instead of thinking about it in a categorical way, we should think about it more dimensionally. Maybe these extreme racists, there is something psychiatrically wrong with them, even if it's not just delusional. Controversial area. I want to use the last few minutes to talk a little bit about the problem of what happens when you say there's no mental illness. They still are saying and doing the things they're doing. Why? And one thing that got me interested in this topic was I felt like my training didn't really help me with that. And especially when you see the depressing news. Anytime you read this is a real polling organization, 2013, and it showed that 5% of the country, US, still thinks Paul McCartney was killed or died in the 60s. They think 15% think that there's mind control. 14% believe in Bigfoot. 21% Roswell cover-up. 6% Bin Laden alive. 28% New World Order. So explain some of the QAnon beliefs. Lizard people. Moon landings fake. Chemtrails. My favorite, 18% of the population in this 23 poll. It was like, is this real? Are they putting them on? Believe that the sun revolves around the earth. When I see polls like this, I get very sad, because what it makes you realize is a lot of people are just, I don't want to say dumb, but something is wrong with people that think that the earth is going, or the sun is going around the earth. And I think it's introduced us to our new thing, QAnon, which I have a whole talk on QAnon. I got one slide, but unfortunately now QAnon is starting to take on some of the sovereign citizen strategies. They're starting to use the paper terrorism and the liens in their tactics. So we're not done with this. Just a few more slides. Research on conspiracy thinking is fascinating. It looks at there's clinical research, but there's also research on normative people. And studies on conspiracy thinking have looked at people who believe in conspiracy. Some of them are just people with a very high degree of psychological distress, or people that feel a need for order in a certain world. Some of them are overtly psychotic, like Jared Lautner. But also there's a lot of people with schizotypal traits that fly under the radar. And they're not clinical, but they really are probably clinical if you've gotten into their thinking a little bit more. But even in normative populations, non-clinical populations, there's studies that have been done on the differences in the way people think. Some people that gravitate to conspiracy thinking, they're less analytical in their thinking. They rely more on what are called emotional heuristics, these sort of quick snap judgments about the world. People with higher level of education are less likely to accept simple explanations for the world. But that may not be enough. There's often highly educated people that believe in conspiracy theories. So it's not just education and the wealth that sometimes comes with having a more secure life. There may be neurobiological factors at play. So what do we know? Well, a lot, but not a lot I can share with you in a few minutes. But what have been studied are these different cognitive biases, and they have different names, and they're fascinating because they're not in the DSM, and we're not taught them. But let me just throw one or two at you. I ask people, you know how a toilet works? Everyone's like, I want to know how a toilet works. Okay, build one. Okay, we all think we know how things work, but the reality is we have this illusion that we know more than we do. That's normal, but there have been studies that have been done on this illusion of exploratory depth that show that people who have a very superficial knowledge of politics, but think that they know a ton about politics, are unsurprisingly more likely to believe in conspiracy theories about politics. Everyone's heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I love the story. There was a bank robber who put lemon juice on his face because lemon juice is invisible ink, right? If you're 9. But he really thought that was going to fool the cameras. And this so fascinated these two psychologists, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, that they wrote a paper about the Dunning-Kruger effect, people of low ability having illusory superiority. And by the way, if you Google the Dunning-Kruger effect, you will see evidence of the Dunning-Kruger effect by the people who talk about it, because almost all of them get it wrong. This is not the Dunning-Kruger effect. It doesn't look remotely like this. The actual study shows some increased confidence by people who know nothing. And it's fairly flat. It's not this gigantic Mount Stupid and despair valley that everyone says. We all know about confirmation biases because we experience them, but people who adhere to conspiracy beliefs not only have greater confirmation biases, but they gravitate towards online echo chambers. There have been studies that have been done that people with very extreme beliefs gravitate to homophilous groups. They don't want to be around people that have other ideas. When you try to separate this out by politics, both extreme left and extreme right gravitate to homophily, but non-extremists, moderates and liberals, tend to be more open to, according to this study, greater viewpoints. Conservative thinking tends to lean a little bit more towards a desire for people who agree. But the matrix is controlling us. So when I go to Facebook, I see dorky stuff like art and technology and maps, because I'm a big nerd. But when QAnon hit, you would be recommended all these QAnon sites, which have now mostly been banned. But if the algorithms aren't changed, someone with a pre-existing confirmation bias is going to gravitate towards even more radicalized thinking. Conspiracy people think about disproportionality. The example of the proportionality bias is big events must be caused by big things. So something as evil as the Holocaust must have been caused by this incredibly evil government led by this incredibly evil person. But what about John F. Kennedy's assassination? He was killed by an underemployed nobody, a loser, Lee Harvey Oswald. That makes no sense. People who gravitate to conspiracy buffs gravitate towards the idea that there must be some forces that are bigger. It can't just be this unlucky day for Kennedy. And this drives one of my final points about conspiracy theorists, which is nothing happens by accident. They tend to gravitate to what's called the teleological fallacy. It's the same thing that drives creation thinking, which is there must be an underlying force that is guiding the hand of the universe. But they also will gravitate towards something called the intentionality bias, the view that other people's behavior is always intentional. There are no accidents. We all do this a little bit, but people who gravitate toward conspiracies, they score much higher. Conspiracy buffs have some funny ideas about randomness and chance. I've got a whole talk on gambling that I won't be giving today. But I do want to talk about one last study, because one of the strangest things of all is a study that shows that conspiracy followers have problems with recognizing patterns. So all of you know Jackson Pollock, splatters of paint. Go to the MoMA and you can see his wonderful, unusual art. Obviously Jackson Pollock, obviously Jackson Pollock, obviously Jackson Pollock, definitely not Jackson Pollock. This is Victor Vasselli, who was the creator of op art. There was a fascinating study that was done that looked at people's adherence to conspiracy beliefs, and then it showed them these paintings. And people with low degrees of conspiracy thinking, they look at Jackson Pollock and they're like, yeah, it's a bunch of blobs. But people that had a very high orientation towards conspiracy thinking would see patterns. And they wouldn't see these patterns in these Vasselli paintings, which actually are very patterned. And I was fascinated with this because as a JFK assassination buff, I was always fascinated by how they would blow up the picture of the grassy knoll. And you'd see all these blobs and grains, and conspiracy buffs would say, look, you can see the gunman. And I'd look and it's like, I can't see a thing. No, he's there. Is there something different? And there's a lot of studies that have looked at this idea of illusory pattern perception, and not just patterns in things like photos, but patterns in coin flips and patterns in gambling. So what's our solution? Because it seems pretty depressing. Well, one solution has been to educate the courts, which the FBI, the ADL have done a good job. And here's a case in Colorado recently where a sovereign was found in competency in trial, and later in the appeals process, they recognized it. So that's good. Prison, some people say, well, that's their solution. Send them to prison, screw them. And that's where a lot of them wind up. I'm a little unsatisfied with that. And I started my career doing competency restoration, and it was very satisfying to help somebody with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder find the right treatment that restored them to competency. Sovereign citizens, I typically say, well, they are competent, but they're not thinking right. Are there things that we can do to de-radicalize them? And it's an area that I think we as a field should really take a deeper look at. There's been a lot of research on de-radicalizing terrorists, de-radicalizing neo-Nazis. I think that the tech companies learning how to get their algorithms a little better is going to be key. And ultimately, there's a fascinating study that actually compared helping sovereigns be empathic towards their victims didn't make any difference at all. But then it compared that to just humiliating them and making fun of them. And ridicule actually did reduce their beliefs some. But what really reduced the beliefs of people with conspiracy-like beliefs was targeted rational arguments, particularly if those arguments came from somebody that they had respect for. So I've not given up the idea that when somebody espouses these beliefs that they're a lost cause because they simply don't have delusional disorder. I think there are ways that we can engage and confront some of this thinking. So thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to use whatever time we have left for questions about this interesting movement. Yes, sir, in the back.
And you talk about the different.
I think it's extremely hard as a society, partially because the people with the power to develop interventions are the objects of the paranoia. So
sound. I wonder if you could repeat the
yes,
question.
the question was essentially, how do we engage with this problem at a, which is at a very large level? Is that a good way of looking at it? We as psychiatrists aren't going to fix it. We're just a small part of the problem, or a problem of the solution, particularly if we're consulted in court. Most of these people are not going to seek psychiatric help unless you get a situation, which has happened in some cases, where the wife tells her husband, if you don't get some help with your QAnon obsession, our marriage is over. And there are cases of people who have gotten de-radicalized simply because they were losing their loved ones, their relationship with their children. But for us as a field, these are one-off individual experiences. It's, if the Biden administration announced a major endeavor to de-radicalize people, these are the exact people that would be, Alex Jones would be all over that. And so the problem is that when the people with the power to make the changes are the objects of the beliefs, it's hard to do it. One thing that is promising is the area of content moderation. And I consult with a company that is involved in content moderation. And there aren't enough human beings to monitor content online, but there's artificial intelligence and bots, reporting systems, and some like Twitter and Facebook have gotten a lot better than they used to be. Some are still terrible. There's certain places like Reddit and 4chan that are just cesspools that allow anything in. But and so, for example, you'll see, if you look up Sovereign Citizen now, you will see a disclaimer on YouTube. A lot of people are going to roll their eyes and ignore it, but some people are going to click it and it's going to link them to some educational material. The tech companies also can change their algorithms in a way that doesn't encourage people to self-radicalize. That's been one of Facebook's biggest criticisms is, when Q hit, as soon as you started looking at Q, it would say, maybe you would like these, because it's not a human, it's just a computer saying, oh, you like knitting, here's more knitting. Oh, you like, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from the 1700s? Here you go, Protocols of Zion. And so the computers are dumb and they're only as good as we program them. So I think that our tech companies can do things about it. Our government has some ability. They've been very successful with people once they get in prison. Europe has done a great job of actually de-radicalizing Islamists. I mean, they still have huge problems, but the research on de-radicalization of conspiracy theorists, a lot of it is coming from Europe, where Al-Qaeda, ISIS have recruited young, angry men in impoverished communities in Europe. We've done that to some degree with neo-Nazis, but there's other groups where there's been almost no outreach. So, for example, the Moorish Sovereign Citizen has sort of been off people's radar because people have looked at these beliefs as a white conspiracist Western rancher problem, and not realizing that once the virus starts spreading into people's minds, you can get new age hippies. There's a lot of people on the left that adhere to sovereign citizens. So it's kind of a mind virus, but it's going to be challenging. But I think for us, part of the solution is not doing the 15-minute med check. One of the saddest things about being a forensic psychiatrist is that you see these people that have gotten bad care for their whole lives because they get 15 minutes. Oh, that sounds weird. That's crazy. Here's an antipsychotic. See you next time. And when somebody gets charged with a crime, we spend hours with them, sometimes days with them. And so then you can just take a deep dive and not just say, oh yeah, weird maritime law, the Magna Carta runs the country. He's clearly delusional. That's how you think in a 15-minute med check. If you really know the patient, you get to know them, you do this assessment of beliefs. So where we can help as a field is to not rush through our diagnoses. But the other thing is, I think our general training programs need to teach logical fallacies. They need to teach cognitive biases. We tend to teach the DSM because that's our book, but there's lots of experts in other disciplines, psychologists, linguists, philosophers that I think can add to our thinking. And cognitive biases is something that once I sort of understood things like teleological fallacies, it made so much more sense to me, even though the DSM says nothing. Yes, Dr. Rowe. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, we are out of time. Thank you all for your attendance, and thank you, audience. online.